questions. I'm trying to get here from Ed, and people walk really slow in the halls. Okay, I might have to start walking outside or getting a dog sled team. Okay, so welcome back to SOC 100. I have not really been keeping an eye on like the class roster, so I'm not sure. I'm assuming people have kind of swapped in and out at this point. If you are kind of new, this is, mostly the way you're welcome to ask questions by raising your hand. I'm happy to answer any questions you have that way. I found that this is a little bit easier, and I promise I won't do this spiel every single class for the whole semester, just the first few. I found this is easier in big classes, right? Basically, it's called Slido. Scan that QR code or go to slido.com and enter that code, and it'll take you to a kind of Q&A page where you can ask questions in the class, right? And that way, because people are shy, or maybe I miss your hand up as I'm, looking here and there, and it's a big room, although you're kind of all in a straight line in this room, so that helps. I might miss questions, so you can type them in here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Okay. Typical questions. I know there's a few people who are in here probably for the first time. Textbook is optional. If it's helpful, if it's helpful to you, get it. The exams are non-cumulative, right? So you don't, once we're clear of, the first section of the course, you don't have to worry about that content on the second midterm. And then you don't have to worry about it again on the final, right? Each of them is like a third of the course tested. And so wherever we get, and lots of practice material and all of that stuff. Okay. Я тоже не нравится Putin. No, это... I know, не знаю. Yes, the lectures are recorded, and I will put them up on eClass. Okay, let's clear the Russian profanity off of there. So the lectures are recorded, and I'll have a playlist up on eClass. I've just been kind of scrambling the first few days, getting stuff set up, and we got a big research project starting in the Center for Criminological Research, looking at reintegration. And so, we've got people going off to Red Deer and Grand Prairie next week. So I'm coordinating that. So I haven't had time to put the link up and get everything set. But once, and I'll show you next, I'll try to do it tomorrow, and I'll show you next class, where it is on eClass and all of that stuff. Yes, I fixed that. I had just forgotten to change the title. I had the block for Reading Week, but I think I had it labeled as Globalization. And I just changed it and re-uploaded the syllabus. So it now says Reading Week, and that, I don't know, it's like February 20 something. And then I switched the one that I had listed as Reading Week. It's just that Reading Week in the winter term moves around every year. So yeah, I have fixed it now. It's so the dates are correct. And no, it doesn't change the date of the exams at all, because I had it right in my head. I just failed to write it down properly in the syllabus. Okay. Whew. Man, it is toasty in this class. It's very hot. I don't know, is it hot up there too, or is it just down at the bottom? No, it's hot. Okay, that sucks. Okay. Could this building burn down? I don't know. What did I see? Being a university professor is easy. It's like riding a bike, except the bike is on fire, you're on fire, the building's on fire, everything's on fire. It's kind of how it feels this semester. Okay. Are the exams open book? They are not. They're a closed book. It's 45 multiple choice questions. You write them here in the class. It's on eClass, so it's online, kind of. But it's going to be proctored in this room. I'm going to have my goon squad of senior undergraduates walking around, keeping a close eye on y'all to make sure you're not cheating. And I mean, it ends up being pretty hard to cheat anyway, because there's enough questions that you have to move pretty fast through it. Okay. Other questions? We okay? I'm going to run out of tea at some point here. All right. I guess let's begin. So what is sociology, right? So I'm presuming, maybe I'll turn the volume on the mic down just a little bit. I feel like God talking to you. Hello. There, is that better? Okay, that feels a little better to me. Yeah, so basically what is sociology, right? Um, in like basic terms, right, sociology is meant to be the study of society, right? And it is a social science, right? One that, and again, this is according to the American Psychological Association, one that is basically there to study the lives of people, groups, and societies, right? And how people interact, with each other, with groups, with institutions in society. It studies people's behavior as social beings, as opposed to, say, psychology, which is more interested in a lot of ways in individuals. Unless you're in social psychology, then you get the best of both worlds. And it looks at kind of, how you relate to each other in, different ways, from the very small level, to your personal interactions with your friends, your families, with the barista at Starbucks, with the people in line with you, with the people you bumped into, with your professor, right? Those face-to-face interactions, to bigger levels where you interact with institutions, and then interactions on, say, the global level as well. Okay, it is, at least in its kind of premise, meant to be scientific, right? It is a social science, and it is meant, at least in principle, to follow the scientific method, right? It is meant to be basically something that looks through a scientific lens at the way the world is organized. So meant to make objective, kind of empirical observations about society and about the things that are happening, right? Okay, it's sometimes, referred to in a sense as the queen of the sciences, or at least the queen of the social sciences, in that it is, kind of an amalgamation discipline, right? We throw this word interdisciplinary around. It looks, in a lot of cases, right, you take the insights that are found in other disciplines, in things like history, psychology, economics, anthropology, and sociology kind of tries to mash them all together to create a better understanding of the world as a whole. It's often thought of as this kind of unifying social science that brings together all of the other social sciences. Though obviously, other social sciences, that's at least how sociologists conceive of it. Other social scientists tend, I think, to be a little bit less generous to sociology at the best of times. Okay. So, I guess why, the book that I kind of based the course on, right, the textbook, Sociology, Compass for a New Century or whatever it is, or Compass for a New Social World. The last edition was Compass for a New Century. Sociology, basically as a discipline, the idea is that, it's supposed to be liberating, right? A liberating practical activity. Finding, the things about the world that cause problems for people, and hopefully by pointing them out, helping to alleviate them. It can help you, understand who you are, and what you can become, and who you are in the sense of like, how do the groups that you're a part of, right? How do, the way you were raised, the society that you come from, the religious tradition or no religious tradition that you're in, the schools you went to, all of these things, how do they shape, who you are, and, what your potential is at the end of the day? And are there ways that, say, people's potential is held back ultimately by these big kind of social forces? And I guess at its goal, right, the idea of sociology and what sociologists have wanted, since the days of Karl Marx in the middle part of the 19th century, was to create the best possible future, right? By identifying social problems, can you create a better world, right? Can you identify them and ultimately fix them? And it's meant to do this, ultimately by being a systematic study of human behavior and change in the social context, right? So how do people behave in the social context, and what are the limits that society puts on people, and where could those maybe be changed or alleviated? Okay. So the main goal of sociology in lots of ways is to identify and explain how, and this will be important, how personal troubles are connected to social structures, right? So when something, happens in an individual person's life or in the lives of a group of people, they face discrimination, poverty, health struggles, any of these kinds of things, how are those ultimately connected to bigger social structures, right? If we talk about, say, something like Gen Z and the fact that Gen Z as a generation, so most of you in this class, Gen Z as a generation is having trouble, launching into adulthood, especially doing things like buying houses. How is that connected to bigger social structures like education, like banking, right? Like finance, or even global level things like globalization? How are these things connected? How is the fact that you can't buy a house in Edmonton in 2023 connected to these big social institutions and social systems that you have to navigate through in your life, right? How is all of it ultimately related? How are your personal problems or the personal problems of people around you connected to these bigger institutional structures, right? So what are social structures? Sometimes we refer to these as social institutions, and I will kind of use those terms a little bit interchangeably, but they're basically these relatively stable patterns of social relations that people have to navigate, right? So again, I think I have this on the next slide. I sometimes get ahead of myself, and I'm very sorry in advance for the fact that I know what's on these slides and I get ahead of myself. We could kind of think of social structures as occurring in kind of three spheres, right? Or three levels. Microstructures, right, which are, like I was saying a moment ago, your personal kind of interactions that are formed during face-to-face contact with other people, right? So this would be, again, your family, your friends, if you come and talk to me, right? If, you go to the Starbucks and you yell at the barista for getting your order wrong, or you're very nice to them, right? These are all microstructures, right? Your personal relationships with people in the world. Macrostructures, right? This is where most of us spend a lot of our lives kind of interacting with social institutions, right? So macrostructures are, things that are, this definition's a little bit confusing maybe, but basically, right, these are social relations outside and above your circle of intimate acquaintances, right? But still typically at the kind of local level. When you are, say, going to the bank, right, you need to get a loan, or, you're trying to get your student loans approved, or you're going to the grocery store, right, and purchasing things, or Walmart, or you interact with Canada Revenue Agency in some way, right, or the university, right, if you need to get a course changed, or something like this, you're ultimately dealing with things at the level of a macro structure, right? These bigger kind of social institutions that are above the level of your kind of intimate acquaintances, right? Well, you might have a microstructure interaction with the barista at Starbucks. You're having a macrostructure interaction with Starbucks as an institution. When you might be having a conversation with me as your professor in a microstructure, but you're in this kind of this class, and then the institution that we're both a part of is the macro structure of the University of Alberta and the education system in general. Okay, and then at the level just above that, I guess, is global structures, and these are social relations above the national level. So you can think of big global institutions as making up the bulk of this, right? Things like the United Nations, NATO, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, all of these sorts of things as kind of global structures. The global banking system, though it isn't a single structure, you can think of it as a global structure, because you can get off a plane in Shanghai and go to an ATM and get money out in local currency that comes out of your bank account here, right? These interrelated kind of global systems are all global structures. I really need a question slide to make sure everyone's... Are social psychology and sociology closely related? So it's a good question. Social psychology is a sub-branch of both sociology and psychology. So you'll find social psychologists housed in either sociology or psychology departments. But yeah, it's basically a sub-discipline, right? When we talk about social psychology, right, these are usually sociologists that are applying some kind of psychological sort of insights to talk about individuals. But yeah, it's basically a sub-branch of both. Okay, did I go back far enough? All right, so the sociological imagination, what is it? Okay, so basically, the sociological imagination is this term that was come up with by, I think, Herbert Mills, and wrote about it in 1959. And basically, the sociological imagination is what, basically sociologists sort of ask people to do, right? It is to basically try and connect, right? To try and think about and imagine how those personal troubles that people have, right? The inability to buy a house, that difficulty getting a job, right? You can't find a romantic partner because online dating sucks, right? The sociological imagination, I don't know. I've never online dated. And from what I've heard, God willing, I'll die before my wife does and never have to deal with this nightmare. I'm not 6 foot. I don't have any hair. I drive a minivan. So I think I'm completely out of luck if I ever try an online dating. And, good times. University professors also don't make that much money. So, screwed. But the fact that it's hard to find a romantic partner in the online dating world, right? The sociological imagination is about trying to get people to imagine, yourselves, me, and anybody else who's interested in sociology, to think about how is that problem people are having connected to bigger social structures. Like if we think about online dating, right? How might your inability to find a romantic partner maybe be connected to the fact that a lot of the way you meet people now is mediated by for-profit companies that are charging you a fee to use their service and maybe don't want you to find a romantic partner too quickly, because if you hit the first person you match with, that's not a great business model. But if you have to subscribe for 2 years before you finally find someone you actually like, that's a much better business model for the corporation, right? So what does Mills say, right? What people need to have a sociological imagination is a quality of mind, right? That helps them see what's going on in the world, what might be happening within themselves, and how these things are connected, right? How these big macro forces in the world, are ultimately connected to what is happening for people, right? Anyway, we can imagine a million ways that this ultimately, and we'll talk about some of the ways that people have imagined, how these macro forces in the world affect people's lives. We'll go through that through the course. But the idea is to start thinking about it through this lens of an imagination that sees, macro structures as connected to people's troubles and global structures, and even, potentially microstructures in the ways that it might, structure things like gender relations, right? Do you come from a very traditional family that might have structured you to think in very traditional ways about gender roles? Or, do you come from a very progressive family, that has you thinking about them in very progressive ways, right? You turn 13 and your parents hand you a box of condoms and tell you, go to town. That kind of microstructure interaction ultimately might shape your life in very profound ways, as opposed to, you enter puberty and your parents tell you that, if you lose your virginity, you're like a crumpled flower that can never be made beautiful again. These things can all kind of shape, people's lives in very profound ways, right? So it's trying to think how all these structures that we're in ultimately affect life. Have I tried looks maxing? No. I got married young and avoided this entire problem. That's what I did. Shockingly young by today's standards, even. Be quiet. The awkward thing is I don't know if you're male or female, so I'm like, I don't know what to think about that. Should have bought a house in 2008 instead of being 4 years old. What were your parents thinking? Okay. I got married when I was 23. We were pretty young. By today's standards, we were babies because I think for men now, the average age of first marriage for men is 31 or 32. So well ahead of the game. And it's worked out amazing. Okay. Do you need to memorize the names of people and know what they did? Oh, yes. Anxiety. No, I understand because you've all been hurt before. Professors are either in the camp of hurting you or helping you. Most of them are the hurting kind. In terms of the names, right, we're going to remember the big schools of sociology and probably the three really big thinkers. So this is going to be Marx, Durkheim, Weber. Most of the other people, right, I'm going to tell you about them more in how they developed the field of sociology. But when it comes to the multiple choice questions, I'm not going to ask you very specifically, like, what did Herbert Spencer say, right? Like, no, I'm not going to do that. There's a billion names through the course, and I could make really difficult questions, where it's like, who said this? Was it Foucault, Derrida, Baudrillard, or Lyotard? And that would be a really hard question because you'd be like, I can't remember. But I'm more concerned about the concepts. Like the big schools, conflict theory, structural functionalism, and symbolic interactionism, and then some of the sub-schools. But the specific figures are mostly less important, right? Outside of Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, who are the founders of the three big schools. Okay, hopefully that puts you at ease. If not, I don't know what to tell you. All right. So I don't know why I'm checking the time. It's because I'm running out of tea, and I'm like mildly panicked that I'm going to run out of tea and lose my voice before my fourth class of the day. All right. So where does sociology ultimately come from, right? And basically, most people locate its origins in these three big revolutions in Western society starting in the 16th century. Right? And like, should you know, okay, so here's what I'll say, because I'm going to get this question. It may already be on the question slide. You don't need to know these specific dates, right? So I'm not going to ask you, when did the scientific revolution begin? Was it 1550, 1551, 1552, or 1553? I'm not going to do that. They're general dates. So don't worry about the dates specifically, but understand what each of these revolutions are and why they're important to sociology. Okay. So, like I said, I've taught this class a lot of times, so I can kind of anticipate the questions that are coming. All right, so the scientific revolution, circa around the 1550s, right? So middle part of the 16th century. And I'm sure you've all been hearing about this, since elementary school. So I don't belabor the point with the scientific revolution. But the scientific revolution basically marked a change in the way that people tried to understand the world, right? Prior to this, the principal mode that people were using was what was called natural philosophy, right? Where basically people tried to reason philosophically about the nature of the world, right? And so, you would get things out of like Aristotle that, the world was made up of four elements: earth, wind, water, and fire, right? That basically, because trees can burn, there must be fire inside them. So clearly a tree is a form of fire, right? That was kind of natural philosophy. Kind of towards the end of the Middle Ages, right, the medieval period, you get a transformation, what's called the scientific revolution, just the culmination of a lot of philosophy that had been done, in the 12th and 13th and 14th and 15th centuries. But a move towards, this idea of empiricism, right? The idea that the best way to learn about the world is through direct observation, through the senses, and particularly observation that can be repeated by other people, right? So at its best, right, and this isn't always the case in any discipline, sociology certainly being a social science, sometimes it's hard to reproduce it, but studies that are done, but at its best, right, the idea of sociology is that we should be making observations about the social world that if someone else was looking at the same thing, they would see the same phenomena, right, and interpret it roughly in the same way. The idea is, right, to be like the natural sciences, but for society. So, it comes out of, right, this idea of empiricism, and then this idea of empiricism that starts with the natural sciences, then as it wildly succeeds, right? Science blossoms, life gets better. People are like, could we take the same tool set of the natural sciences, especially empiricism, and apply it to other things like society to make those things better as well? Okay. The democratic revolution, right, coming out of the period of the so-called Enlightenment, right, you get this idea, coming from people like John Stuart Mill, Rousseau, I'm afraid of Voltaire, right, and all of these Enlightenment thinkers in places like England, France, Scotland, that are saying, hey, we need a different way of thinking about how the world is organized, right? And they start to question, this idea of, in a sense, the way the world had been thought of in the Middle Ages, right? That there's God, and God says, okay, every person is in the place that they are put by God, right? So if you're the king because God wants you to be the king. And if you're a serf, on a farm where your family's lived for 500 years and you have no wealth and you're barely sneaking by, keeping enough grain to feed yourself over the winter, well, that's where God wanted you to be too. And these thinkers come around, in the, principally in the 18th century, and start to kind of question this. And they say, well, actually, maybe people, society isn't kind of naturally there because God put it there. But, people are responsible for putting together society. Society reflects a certain kind of logic, this idea of a social contract between the rulers and the ruled. And maybe, people should have some say in shaping how their society is governed. Okay, so, this really comes ultimately to its kind of first flowering, if you will, in 1776 with the American Revolution, right, and the creation of the United States as a republic, right, where people, not everybody at first, but increasingly over time, more and more people basically get a say in how the country is run, right? First landowners, male landowners, and then eventually, women, black people, and more people kind of get the ability to vote, right? But fundamentally, the change is between a taken for grantedness of the world and a sense that, we're responsible for creating society and everybody should have a say in how society is ultimately shaped at the end of the day. And we could make it better, right? Through kind of collective action and representation of everybody, we can make the world better. And then finally, and actually in a lot of ways, probably the most important one, is the Industrial Revolution, which starts at the end of the 18th century, right? It's kind of 1770s, 1780s. And really fundamentally transforms the world, right? We go from, kind of the end of feudalism in Europe, where, basically people lived and kind of farmed land that had probably been farmed by their families for centuries. People were mostly living subsistence, and then that whole system falls apart. An industrial system of manufacturing, and people worked in guilds, right? And so you were the blacksmith. You were in the blacksmith guild, so you were a blacksmith or a cobbler, or some kind of skilled craft. And then that whole system basically, within a few decades disappears under the weight of this transformation from an agricultural economy to a burgeoning manufacturing economy. And what happens with the Industrial Revolution, and again, I'm sure you know this, I'll just remind you, is that you get a lot of urbanization, right? Factories get set up principally in cities. A lot of people get kicked off the land that they had been, farming with their families for centuries, but didn't belong to them because it belonged to, the lord or the estate they happened to be on. And they, in order to support themselves, moved to the cities to work in factories to support themselves. And what this does is it creates enormous social problems, right? You get these massive cities with big slums, incredibly poor people working in these factories, really long hours, really, really brutal conditions, at least at first. And this sort of inspires the attention of intellectuals, specifically people who are worried about, the people who are working in these factories and the kind of whole social dislocation that has come from the transformation in the way things are made in the whole economic system. And because that transformation is so rapid and in a lot of ways so violent, it creates a whole bunch of people who are really interested in thinking about, what this means and how ultimately some of the problems could be alleviated. And probably the most famous of these is Karl Marx, right? There are certainly others. But Karl Marx, right, with his whole idea, and we'll talk about Marx, in a lot in the course. But Marx, observed that, in his native Germany and then in England, right, that industrialization had created really terrible conditions for the working class, who did all of this work and barely got to benefit from, the results of their work, right? He saw them essentially almost as slaves, slaving away for bare subsistence wages, while the owners of the means of production, those lucky few, got incredibly rich and were incredibly prosperous. And so out of that industrial revolution, we get, the beginnings of sociology and the flourishing of the three big schools of sociology, starting with Marx and conflict theory, but then, followed up with someone, who learned a lot from Marx in Weber, and then Emil Durkheim as well. Okay. But before we get to Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, I have to talk about a few other people. All right, so Auguste Comte. Comte is basically, he's a French thinker, right? Obviously you see, and again, you don't have to know his date of birth or when he died or any of this stuff, so don't worry about that. Or even when sociology was coined as a term. I won't ask questions about that. But basically, Comte was the first to he coined the word sociology and was the first to kind of suggest that we should use the scientific method in order to better understand how society was being organized, what some of the social problems were, and how they could ultimately be alleviated, right? Now, I think it's worth noting that Comte never did any actual sociology, right? He was interested in the idea of sociology. He comes up with the term, right? And I mean, this is just your straight up Greek, right? So it's a socio, which means society, and logos, which means knowledge about. So knowledge about society, right? That's what sociology is. So comes up with it, but really never does it. But his proposal that, we should use the tools of the scientific revolution to learn about society ultimately gets taken up by other people. Oh, before I get to Spencer, should have spaced a few more. Is there going to be a study guide for our test? Yes. What should you take note of on people in the slides? Their key insights, I guess, their thoughts, what was important about them. Okay, cool. So Herbert Spencer. All right, so Herbert Spencer, another early figure, kind of a contemporary of Karl Marx in particular. Herbert Spencer, all right, it's dead to me. I drop them, I just pick up another one. There's like 50 of them in this room. Just something to fiddle with. Yeah, so Spencer, another kind of early person thinking about the social world. Really influenced here, right? A lot of influences at the beginning of sociology were what was going on at the time. And one of the theories that strongly influenced Herbert Spencer, and this, in a lot of ways ends up having some tragic consequences, which I'll tell you about in a second, is Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, right? So, Spencer is around at about the same time that this idea has really entered the mainstream. And he's looking at the social world and sort of thinking, okay, if we accept the theory of evolution by natural selection, what other spheres would this idea be true in, right? So basically, Spencer theorized that societies probably evolve the same way as biological species ultimately do. So there's a couple of, social inequalities, right, he thought were necessary in the same way as weaknesses, the survival of the fittest, was necessary for evolution. Some social inequalities, and problems were necessary for societies to evolve and ultimately surpass them. And this became known as the idea of social Darwinism. Now, this has a couple of tragic consequences, because one of the things inherent to theories like Spencer's, and he certainly wasn't the only one espousing these kinds of ideas, was that there are some societies that are more evolved and some societies that are less evolved than others, right? And of course, being, English, his perception was that English society and European society in particular, but particularly, white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, was the most evolved form of social organization. And that all other forms of social organization, right, all other societies were in some way less evolved, right, more primitive than Europeans, right? And this idea gets picked up in all sorts of ways I think are recognizable to us, with, almost 200 years, like 200-ish years of distance from a lot of these ideas. One being that, less evolved societies should be brought up to the level of European society, or the members of that society should be brought up, or that they could be conquered, controlled, and otherwise sort of, dominated by these more evolved societies that could hopefully, bring them up to speed, right? So a lot of, say, the colonialist project, the imperial project of the 19th and early 20th centuries follows this kind of logic from someone like Herbert Spencer, right? So things like residential schools, right, follow this same kind of logic, that Europeans are of a more evolved society, indigenous people are of a less evolved society, and so Europeans should, basically try to raise up indigenous people to European kind of levels, with all the tragic results that come from that, right? So sociology, at times, has also been, the generator of bad ideas, right? And I don't want to gloss that over. The other thing that tends to come up with this idea of social Darwinism is that it was an idea popular in two movements. The first one was the eugenics movement, and the eugenics movement was a broad movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries that basically said, one of the things that was holding society back was the less evolved members, and that we should basically, try to select who gets to have children based on what traits they have, and we should try to create a society that has all good. You should basically try to create a society where people have more of the beneficial kind of traits and fewer of the bad ones. And so this led to things like the sterilization of, disabled people, right? Basically saying, particularly those that have kind of developmental delays, saying we shouldn't allow those people to reproduce and pass on their bad genes. We should, sterilize them and only let, the most, desirable genes proliferate. Of course, this also kind of proliferated in a group of people in the 1930s in Germany. You might have heard of them. They're called the Nazis. The Nazis, right, were big fans of these ideas of social Darwinism as well, right? There were more developed and less developed societies, and that we should, in our quest for, breeding the Aryan race, basically the goal was to foster those genetic characteristics that would create the kind of, the best people, right? So, and again, with all of the attendant kind of horrors that come with Nazism, a lot of it is tied to the development of this idea of social Darwinism. And it took until really the middle part of the 20th century for these ideas, even maybe the late part of the 20th century, for these ideas in a lot of ways to be fully sort of denounced by most people, right? And the horrors of the Second World War in particular were an inflection point. Okay, so this brings us, I think, and maybe that'll be a good place to leave it after this slide, that there's this constant tension in sociology, right? Yeah, there's a belief in the importance of science and the importance of studying society, and that we really do want to create the vision of an ideal society, right? A society that is better than what came before it. And we see this in the works of all the sociologists, right? Even Herbert Spencer, right, wanted to create a better society, right? It had this idea that with science, we could create societies that were better. But there's always this tension that there's a danger, as sociologists, as people making recommendations about the world and how we could ultimately transform it, that there's a lot of room to make mistakes and for these ideas to go fundamentally wrong. So it's something that has to be kind of done really, really carefully, right? We have to proceed with caution because, the list of things that can go wrong, don't stop with Spencer, right? A lot of the ideas of someone like Karl Marx, who I think was genuinely well-intentioned, ultimately spiraled down into, the oppressive communism of the Soviet Union and of other communist states that should be, kind of very, very carefully watched to make sure that those things don't happen again. And so sociologists also always have to be aware that there's this danger in thinking we know how to fix the world, but we might actually make it worse. And at least one of the big schools of sociology, structural functionalism, really takes that to heart. But we'll talk about that on Friday. Yeah. Oh, maybe I'll answer this question before you go. Would Spencer believe that some people are inherently less than others and can't be improved? Definitely so, right? There were some genetic characteristics that made one person stronger, smarter than the other, and that therefore, can be fixed. Or can't be fixed, rather. All right. We'll see you on Friday.